The violinists were still playing when she saw her nameplate. Burden. Helen Carter, 72, widow and retired nurse, steadied her hands against the tablecloth. Her son, the boy she once carried through night fevers, now smiled as if the insult was part of the decor. But when she rose and walked out, whispers followed her to the door. By morning, the photos of the perfect wedding were headlines for all the wrong reasons. And when the marriage faltered, everyone remembered the empty seat that started it all. I'm curious, where in the world are you joining us from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed for all the latest updates. The Charleston summer air pressed heavy against Margaret's chest as she stepped out of the cab, smoothing down the navy dress she had ironed twice that morning. The church loomed ahead, historic brick softened by moss and memory, its bells tolling with a kind of indifference. She held her clutch like armor, her palms damp despite the prayer she'd whispered before leaving home. Just get through it with dignity. Inside, the cool hush of the sanctuary was alive with whispers, the rustle of silk gowns, and the clicking of heels across polished floors. White lilies crowded the altar, their perfume cloying, overwhelming. Margaret paused at the entrance, scanning rows of ribbons and satin bows, expecting, hoping to see her name near the front. Instead, an usher, young and stiff in his rented suit, guided her toward the back. His polite smile didn't reach his eyes. "Family is seated up front," Margaret said softly, her voice steady but uncertain. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, gesturing to the last row. "This way." Confusion gripped her as she lowered herself into the pew, glancing at the small card resting neatly on the polished wood. Golden script shimmered against the cream paper. One word: burden. Her throat constricted. She blinked, certain she'd misread, but the cruel letters refused to change. Her heart thudded louder than the organ's prelude. She lifted the card, turning it over, searching for some explanation. Nothing, just that word. Across the aisle, Hannah's friends giggled, hands cupped over glossy lips. The bride herself glided past in rehearsal lace, pausing only to glance over her shoulder. Her smile was sharp as glass. "No mistake," Hannah murmured, low enough for only Margaret to hear. "It's a theme." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter rose, hushed quickly but not silent. Margaret sat frozen, heat rushing to her face. The dress she'd chosen, so carefully elegant but modest, suddenly felt like a costume. She had raised David alone after Robert died. She had worked double shifts, kept the mortgage steady, sold her wedding ring to cover his first semester of college. Every mile of his life she had carried, and now, in the hour he pledged himself to another, this was her seat. Her name, Bird. The choir began humming, a soft prelude to vows that no longer concerned her. Margaret's eyes stung. She folded her hands in her lap, willing herself not to cry, not here, not for them. Her gaze drifted forward, rows filled with Hannah's family, their jewelry glittering, their laughter unburdened. Somewhere near the altar, David shifted, too preoccupied to notice his mother seated in the shadow. The sanctuary seemed to lean away from her, all marble and grandeur conspiring to push her out. A memory flickered. David at 10 years old, holding her hand at Robert's graveside, whispering, "Don't leave me, Mom." She had promised she never would, and she hadn't. Until now. Margaret inhaled slowly, rose to her feet, and smoothed her dress once more. She placed the nameplate back on the pew, aligning it perfectly, a gesture of final respect, not for them, but for herself. The whispers grew louder. A bridesmaid frowned. Susan from the neighborhood tilted her head, pity mingling with curiosity. But Margaret kept her chin high, her shoulders straight. The organ swelled, doors creaked, all eyes waiting for the bride. No one noticed Margaret slip from her pew, her footsteps soft as she reached the back doors of the church, sunlight spilling in like salvation, her pulse steadied with each step. At the threshold, she paused, resting her hand on the carved wood one last time, her voice barely a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through the roar in her chest. She walked out, leaving behind the lilies, the laughter and the word that was never hers to carry. The doors closed behind me, and then the screaming started. The humid air wrapped around her shoulders like a shawl, sticky and relentless, but it felt more honest than the suffocating perfume of lilies inside. Her heels clicked against the stone steps, each sound pulling her further from the humiliation that had just unfolded. She kept her eyes forward, resisting the urge to glance back. The laughter, the whispers, Hannah's smirk, they belonged to another world, one that had never truly made space for her. Halfway across the parking lot, she loosened her grip on her clutch. Her hands still trembled, though her heart no longer raced with shame. It beat now with something else, a quiet, defiant rhythm. Then the sound pierced the air, a shriek. It came muffled at first, then louder, bursting from behind the church door. A rush of voices followed, frantic and discordant, like a choir suddenly out of tune. Margaret froze, the sun burning against her skin. The doors banged open. A bridesmaid in a blush-pink dress stumbled out, heels sinking into the gravel. Mascara streaked her cheeks as she gasped. She fainted, before dashing toward a waiting car. Margaret turned her head slightly, watching as chaos spilled from the sanctuary she had just left. Guests poured out, their polished attire jarring against their panic. Someone yelled for water. Someone else muttered about omen. Margaret's lips parted, but no words came. She lowered her gaze to her car keys, steady in her palm. Her instinct, trained through years of nursing, told her to run back, to help, to do what she had always done, clean up the mess. But another voice, one that had been buried beneath decades of sacrifice, whispered louder. Not this time. She inhaled deeply, grounding herself in the warm asphalt beneath her feet, the cicadas buzzing in the oak trees above, the sky wide and open where no one labeled her a burden. Behind her the bell clanged again, off rhythm now, as though the church itself recoiled from the spectacle. She walked on, one step, then another, heels clicking with measured grace. Her car waited at the far end of the lot, its faded paint glinting faintly in the sun. It wasn't much, but it was hers in a way that nothing inside those walls had ever been. By the time she reached it, her back was damp with sweat, her breath steady. She slid inside, the cool leather seat greeting her like an old friend. For the first time all day, she let her shoulders sag. The air conditioner sputtered to life, humming against the echoes of chaos outside. Margaret closed her eyes, letting the cold air dry the sting of unshed tears. Then her phone buzzed. Once, twice. A relentless vibration against her thigh. She pulled it from her clutch. The screen lit up with a name she had written on school permission slips, on college checks, on birthday cards signed "Love Mom." David. The message preview glowed in harsh white letters. "Where are you? We need you." Margaret stared at it, her pulse steady, her breath calm. She thought of the nameplate, the laughter, the fainting bride who had called her a burden. She thought of every sacrifice that had led to this moment, and how quickly those sacrifices were erased. Her thumb hovered over the screen. For 35 years, her son had needed her, and every time she had answered. She set the phone face down on the passenger seat. The shouts outside dulled as she started the engine, the rumble masking the chaos. The rearview mirror reflected the church doors swinging open again, but she refused to watch. She shifted into drive, her lips parting just enough to let out a single breath of words. "Need me when it matters," she whispered to no one, pressing the gas and rolling away. They needed me when the show cracked, but not when it counted. Margaret kept her hands steady on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the horizon. Her phone buzzed twice more in the cup holder, the screen flashing David's name, but she didn't reach for it. The silence in the car was thick, pressing, almost suffocating, but it was hers. No one laughed at her here. No one smirked. No one called her a burden in gold script. A memory crept in uninvited, the way David had looked at her the night of his prom. His tux too long in the arms, rented and a little shabby, but he had grinned like a king when she pulled out the jacket she had secretly tailored after her double shift. His words still echoed faintly. "Thanks, Mom, you're the best." That boy had trusted her with everything. Where had he gone? She blinked hard and pushed the memory aside. The road signs blurred past. Savannah Highway, Magnolia Road, names she had driven by 1,000 times while rushing to shifts at the hospital. Double shifts, triple shifts, whatever it took to keep the mortgage steady and the fridge stocked. There had never been enough time for her own birthdays, her own quiet celebrations. She had always told herself, one day he'll see, one day he'll understand. Her phone buzzed again. A new message preview lit up. "It's Hannah. Come back. Please." Margaret's throat tightened. The bride who had laughed when she asked if the nameplate was a mistake, now begging. The irony twisted in her stomach, sharp and bitter. She reached a stoplight, red glowing against the glass. Her hand drifted toward the phone. For a moment she imagined pulling a U-turn, rushing back to the church, stepping in as the nurse, the mother, the fixer she had always been. She could still do it, calm the chaos, carry them through. But then, in the rearview mirror she saw herself, hair carefully pinned, pearls at her neck, the lines on her face carved by sacrifice. The woman looking back was not just a mother, she was Margaret. A widow who had buried her husband too early. A nurse who had held strangers' hands through their final breaths. A woman who had stood alone in a church while her own son placed her in the shadows. The light turned green. She pressed the gas. Tears stung, but they didn't fall. Instead, a strange clarity washed over her. Sharp as salt air, she realized she had been living with an illusion, that her son's love depended on her erasing herself. That to be seen by him, she had to stay invisible everywhere else. Her grip tightened on the wheel. "No more," she whispered. The road opened into the familiar streets of her neighborhood, lined with crepe myrtles heavy with blooms. She pulled into her driveway, the small brick house greeting her like an old friend. The shutters needed painting. The porch light leaned crooked. But it was home, her sanctuary, her truth. Inside, the air was still and cool. She placed her clutch on the kitchen counter, kicked off her shoes, and walked straight to the hall closet. Her fingers found the worn metal box tucked on the top shelf. The word estate was scrawled across the lid in her late husband's handwriting. She carried it to the dining table and sat. For a long moment she just stared at it, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. Finally she clicked the latch. Inside lay folders of documents, savings accounts, insurance papers, the deed to the house, a life built through sweat and sacrifice, carefully stacked in manila envelopes. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't look. Instead, she pulled a blank notepad from the box, uncapped a pen, and wrote one sentence across the top of the page. "I was never your burden." Her hand trembled, but not from weakness, from release. The attorney's office smelled faintly of leather and lemon polish, the kind of place where secrets were folded into neat documents and bound with official seals. Margaret sat across from Mr. Hayes, a trim man in his 70s, whose silver hair and steady eyes carried the weight of decades in law. She smoothed the hem of her skirt, a small act to steady herself. The humiliation of the wedding still clung to her like smoke, but she had walked into this room with a clear purpose. "I'd like to make some changes to my will," she said. Her voice didn't shake. Hayes nodded once, opening a fresh file. "Tell me what you have in mind." The words came easier than she expected. "I want to remove my son as a beneficiary." The pen in his hand hovered briefly, but he didn't question her. "And redirect those assets?" "Yes." She inhaled slowly, grounding herself. "To the Charleston Literacy Foundation, and to my nieces and my godchildren, the people who have been family when family turned away." Hayes's pen scratched across the page. His tone was matter of fact, but his eyes softened as he glanced at her. "That's a thoughtful choice. You'll be helping a great many lives." Margaret nodded, though her chest felt heavy. The thought of erasing David from the lines of her will sliced deep. But then, she remembered his nameplate, the gold script that branded her a burden. The image steadied her resolve. "And one more thing," she added, her voice firmer now. "I want a sealed letter include something he can't touch but must read." Hayes raised his brow, curious but not intrusive. "Do you know what you'd like to say?" She pulled a folded sheet of paper from her purse. "I already wrote it." The letter was short, only 4 lines. "I was never your burden, but you chose to make me one. This is the last gift I give you, the freedom to live without me. Use it wisely." Hayes read it, nodded solemnly, and slid it into a sealed envelope. "It will be delivered in accordance with your instruction." For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt something stir in her chest, something like dignity returning. When the papers were drawn up and signed, Hayes stacked them neatly. "There is one more matter," he said carefully. He tapped another folder on his desk. "I reviewed some of your past financials to ensure everything was in order. Did you know your son applied for a line of credit in your name 3 years ago?" Margaret froze. "What?" Hayes opened the folder and slid a page across the desk. The signature at the bottom was hers, or rather a clumsy imitation of hers. The world tilted. Heat flushed through her cheeks, not from shame, but from the realization the betrayal had begun long before the wedding. Hayes's voice was steady. "We can pursue this. It's forgery, clear as day. If you wish, we can go to the authorities." Margaret stared at the paper. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she pushed it back toward him, her hand steady. "No, not the authorities, not yet." Hayes studied her carefully. "Then what would you like to do?" She lifted her chin, eyes bright with something sharper than grief. "We'll take this public. If he wants to brand me a burden, then let the truth brand him." The attorney leaned back, lips pressed thin, then gave a single approving nod. As she rose to leave, the sun through the tall office windows caught her pearls, scattering light across the polished desk. She felt taller, almost lighter. She had entered the office as a mother discarded. She was leaving as a woman unshaken, her story rewritten in ink and law. She whispered to herself, "If this is the son I raised, then he will see the mother he made." Humiliation fades. Documentation doesn't. Not with raised voices or slammed fists, but with stacks of bank statements, hospital invoices, prom receipts, and the brittle pages of old check stubs. Margaret spread them out in careful rows, her hands moving like a nurse triaging patients. Precise, deliberate, unwilling to miss a detail. She hadn't slept much since leaving Hayes's office. The forged signature haunted her, replaying in her mind at odd hours. But now, surrounded by decades of evidence, she felt something shift. She was no longer the woman at the back row with the nameplate. She was building a story no one could dismiss. The neat lines of ink told her life's true narrative, the car payments she shouldered when David was just starting out, the tuition checks written from double shifts, the endless bills she paid when Hannah insisted on a proper wedding. Each line item was a scar no one else could see. She clipped them into folders labeled by year, her handwriting steady. Next to each, she jotted brief notes: second job to cover this, sold Robert's watch that year, loan never repaid. When she slid the folders across Hayes's desk 2 days later, he raised his brows in approval. "This is thorough, Margaret. Very thorough. You understand, this could stand in court, even without the forgery." "I understand," she said, voice calm. "But I'm not interested in punishment, just truth." Hayes tapped the folder. "Truth has consequences." She nodded once. Consequences didn't frighten her anymore. Weddings in this town never stayed private, especially ones that ended in fainting brides and abandoned ceremonies. Margaret overheard two women at the grocery store whispering by the peaches. "Did you hear? They say the mother walked out. Some say it was a bad omen. That's why Hannah fainted." Margaret smiled faintly to herself and kept walking. Let them weave their stories. The real one would come soon enough. Margaret's hands stilled on her teacup. She didn't need to look through the peephole to know. David. When she opened the door, he didn't bother with pleasantries. His face was blotched with anger, his tie askew. "Mom, you ruined everything." The words spilled out hot, frantic. "Hannah's parents are furious. The guests won't stop gossiping. And you walking out like that, do you know how it looked?" Margaret leaned against the doorframe, letting him vent. His fury washed over her like a storm that could no longer touch her skin. "You've always had this way of making it about you," he snapped. "Always the martyr, always the victim." His eyes darted past her shoulder, catching the papers on the dining table. "What's all that?" "Documentation," she said evenly. He frowned, stepping close. "Documentation of what?" She held his gaze, steady as steel. "Of a lifetime. Every bill I paid, every debt you left behind, and this." She reached back, plucked a photocopy from the stack, and slid it into his hand. His face drained as he saw the forgery. the credit line with his clumsy version of her signature. That's, his mouth opened and closed. That's not. Margaret sipped her tea, unhurried. Humiliation fades, but documentation doesn't. You wanted me to be your burden, Dave. Instead, you've written yourself into mine. His hand trembled as he shoved the paper back onto the table. You can't do this. You'll what? She asked softly. Her voice wasn't sharp, but it carried the weight of every year she had bent, carried and sacrificed. You've already done enough. He backed toward the door, muttering threats he couldn't form into sentences. Then he yanked it open and left, the slam echoing through the quiet house. She tore it open to find crisp legal parchment. David was contesting her estate changes. He came with blame. I answered with silence. The knock came again, louder this time, rattling the brass knocker Margaret had polished just yesterday. She already knew who it was. The court papers still lay unopened on her dining table like an uninvited guest. David didn't wait for her to bid him in. He pushed past as soon as the door opened, the smell of cologne and stress clinging to his face was flushed, his voice raised before he even dropped his keys onto her entry table. You've lost it, Mom. Absolutely lost it. Do you realize what you've done? Margaret closed the door gently, letting his fury bounce off her calm. She didn't answer, just walked into the kitchen, the rhythm of her steps even. You embarrassed me in front of everyone, he went on, following her like a shadow. You've been talking to lawyers, digging through paperwork like some obsessed detective, and now you want to erase me from your life, your own son? She opened a cupboard, retrieved 2 cups, and filled the kettle. Porcelain clinked softly, as if mocking his chaos. David slammed a fist on the counter. Are you even listening? She turned, eyes steady. I've been listening for 35 years, David. That silenced him, if only for a breath. She poured the steaming tea, slid 1 cup toward him, then placed a neat stack of papers between them. His brow furrowed as he recognized them. The photocopies of his forged application, the ledger of unpaid debts, the trail she had meticulously pieced together. His bravado cracked. Where did you get these? They were mine all along, she said quietly. Every scrap, every receipt, every favor I thought was love, but was really a debt I paid for you. He shoved the papers away as if they burned his hands. This isn't fair. You're twisting it. I needed help. You forged my name, she interrupted, her voice calm but firm. That wasn't help. That was theft. He tried to laugh, the sound brittle. You wouldn't survive without me. You know that, right? You need me. Margaret lifted her cup, sipped and placed it down without a tremor. I needed Robert. I needed faith. I needed strength to raise you. But you, I don't need you anymore, David. His face flushed crimson. If you don't fix this estate nonsense, I'll take you to court. I'll drag your name through the mud. Everyone will see who you really are. Margaret pushed the stack of documents closer until they touched his arm. They'll see, David, but it won't be me they see. For the first time, his shoulders sagged. He looked like a boy again, lost, cornered, desperate. But the moment passed quickly. He stood, chair scraping against the tile. You'll regret this, he spat, pointing a trembling finger. I swear. Margaret collected the papers, slid them back into their folder, and set her teacup down with a quiet clink. She didn't rise, didn't shout, didn't beg. She simply looked at him the way she used to look at difficult patients, with compassion and distance all at once. The door slammed behind him. The kettle clicked as it cooled. Silence filled the house like a balm. The balm that silence broke the next morning when a sheriff's deputy knocked on her door and handed her a crisp envelope. Inside, a court summons. David was officially contesting her estate changes. They expected me to fold. I brought receipts. ACU. The courthouse smelled faintly of varnished wood and old paper, the kind of place where truths were stripped bare under fluorescent light. Margaret sat near the front, spine straight, her folder of documents resting in her lap like armor. She wore her best navy suit, simple, pressed, not ostentatious. She had chosen pearls over diamonds, dignity over spectacle. David entered late, his tie askew, his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear. His eyes darted to her, expecting tremble, collapse, apology. Instead, she raised her chin. "All rise," the bailiff commanded. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair, scanned the room before settling into her seat. "This matter concerns the estate modifications of Margaret Hayes, contested by her son, David Hayes." David's attorney leapt first. "Your Honor, we intend to prove that Miss Hayes has been manipulated, that her recent changes to her will were made under undue influence. She is unstable, grieving, not of sound mind." Margaret's attorney, Mr. Connolly, rose slowly, voice calm. "We will show not only Miss Hayes's clarity of mind, but also a history of financial abuse from the very person contesting her wishes." The judge nodded. "Proceed." David took the stand, chest puffed like a man playing a role. He spoke of his concern for his mother, how she was lonely, vulnerable, prone to fits of paranoia. He painted himself as dutiful, wronged, the son who only wanted to protect her. "She's been influenced," he insisted, voice cracking theatrically. "She doesn't know what she's doing. She's cutting her own blood out of her life." Margaret sat still, her hands folded neatly. She didn't flinch when the whispers rose among spectators, didn't answer when David looked at her as if daring her to cry. When it was her turn, Connolly placed the folder gently on the stand. "Mrs. Hayes, could you please explain these?" Page after page slid into evidence, credit applications with her forged signature, withdrawals she had never authorized, debts she had quietly covered. Each document was a nail in the coffin of David's testimony. Her voice was steady as she spoke. "I worked as a nurse for 35 years. I know what instability looks like. This," she gestured to the papers, "is not instability. This is betrayal." The judge's eyes flickered toward David. "Mr. Hayes, do you deny signing your mother's name on these?" David stammered, his earlier confidence unraveling. "I don't recall." "That will be enough," the judge cut in. Character witnesses followed. Neighbors testified how Margaret tended her garden daily, volunteered at church, balanced her checkbook with precision. A longtime friend spoke of her generosity. Even Mark, her godson, stood to say, "She has always been clear-headed. She raised me like her own after my parents died. If anyone doubts her mind, they don't know her heart." David shrank in his chair, his lawyer's notes growing more frantic. When the session paused, the judge leaned forward. "We will reconvene with a full ruling in 30 days. Until then, the estate changes remain in effect." The gavel struck once, sharp as thunder. David turned to Margaret on his way out, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. "This isn't over." She gathered her papers with slow precision, rose and walked out without looking at him. Outside the courthouse, the crowd buzzed with whispers. Margaret ignored them, stepping into the sunlight. But when she returned home, she found a single envelope slipped under her door. Inside, scrawled in David's hand, "You'll pay for th-" In the silence of waiting, I found the voice I never had. Her mornings started with coffee at the small oak table she'd sat at for decades, steam curling against the window. She opened a leather journal she hadn't touched since Robert's passing. The pen felt heavy at first, clumsy in her hand, but soon the words poured, not polished or rehearsed, but raw. "I was seated in the back row of my son's wedding," she wrote one morning. "The nameplate called me a burden. Perhaps I was, for my grief, for my age, for my simplicity, but not for my love." The act of writing calmed her, gave her clarity that courtrooms and arguments could not. One Thursday, Susan from her widow's support group invited her to join their weekly circle. Margaret went, hesitantly at first, clutching her notebook like a lifeline. They met in the basement of St. Andrew's Church, folding chairs arranged in a circle, the air thick with coffee and baked goods. One by one, women spoke about loneliness, about children who never visited, about feeling invisible. When it was her turn, Margaret's voice wavered. "At my son's wedding," she began, "they gave me a seat in the back. My nameplate didn't say mother, it said burden." The room grew still. A few women gasped softly. One reached for her hand. "And yet," Margaret continued, stronger now, I walked out. I've spent 62 years swallowing humiliation. This time, I stood up. By the end of the meeting, she wasn't just another grieving widow. She was a story others leaned toward, eyes shining. Susan squeezed her hand as they left. Write it down, she urged. The world needs to hear it. That night, Margaret opened her laptop. She logged into a women's forum she sometimes scrolled through but never posted on. With trembling fingers, she shared her story anonymously, the nameplate, the walkout, the courtroom. She expected silence. By morning her inbox was flooded. Hundreds of responses. Women in Ohio, California, Canada, all echoing her pain. They called me selfish. They called me dramatic. They made me invisible too. Margaret pressed a hand to her chest, stunned. For the first time in years, she felt less alone. Days blurred into weeks. Between gardening, journal entries, and the widow's circle, she began carrying herself lighter. Strangers on the forum began quoting her words. You made me your burden. I made myself free. Then one afternoon, her phone rang. Unknown number. She nearly didn't answer. Mrs. Hayes? A warm voice asked. This is Claire, with the Low Country Stories podcast. Someone shared your forum post with us. We'd love for you to come on the show. Margaret froze. I don't think I'm the type for microphones. Claire chuckled. You're exactly the type, real, brave, unpolished. Your story could help thousands. Margaret stared at Robert's photograph on the mantel. His smile, his eyes. He had always told her she had more strength than she believed. I'll think about it, she whispered. That evening, as she watered her roses, the sun dipped low and fireflies flickered across the yard. Her phone buzzed again, this time, a notification from the podcast's page. Coming soon, the burden mother who walked out. Her story was already moving without her. They silenced me at the wedding. I spoke into a microphone instead. The recording studio wasn't glamorous, just a quiet downtown office, walls padded with gray foam and a single table cluttered with microphones and coffee mugs. Yet, as Margaret stepped inside, her palms damp, it felt more intimidating than any courtroom. Claire, the host, greeted her warmly. We'll just have a conversation, she promised, adjusting the mic. Pretend you're telling your story to a friend. Margaret nodded, though her stomach knotted. She had spent her life serving others' patients. Her husband, her son, speaking for herself felt foreign. The red light blinked on. So Margaret, Claire began, tell us what happened at your son's wedding. Margaret's throat tightened. For a moment, she thought the words would choke her. But then she pictured the golden nameplate, the Snickers, the hollow in her chest. She drew in a breath and let it go. They sat me in the back row, she said softly. And instead of my name, my place card read one word, bird. Silence filled the studio. Claire leaned closer, eyes shining. Margaret continued, her voice steadier. She spoke of years of sacrifice, of raising David alone after Robert's death. She recounted the walkout, the lawsuit, the waiting. She didn't embellish, didn't dramatize, just told it plain. Why did you leave? Claire asked gently. Because I realized, Margaret said, that staying meant agreeing with them. And for the first time, I chose myself. By the time the recording ended, Margaret's cheeks were damp. She hadn't even noticed the tears fall. Claire hugged her. You don't know how many people you just helped. When the episode aired a week later, Margaret braced herself for silence, or worse, ridicule. Instead, her phone buzzed non-stop. Messages from strangers, neighbors, even nurses she hadn't seen in years. Your story gave me courage. I walked out of my daughter's party last night, after years of disrespect. You're not a burden, you're a beacon. The podcast's comment section flooded with support. The episode was shared across Facebook, Twitter, church newsletter. By the weekend, it had a title, The Burden Mother Who Walked Out. Margaret sat in her kitchen, watching numbers climb on the screen. 10,000 listens, 20, 50. She pressed a hand over her heart. At the grocery store, a cashier whispered, Are you that? Margaret's voice trembled with admiration. Margaret smiled shyly. I suppose I am, but not everyone celebrated. Across town, David and Hannah hid in shame. Whispered gossip followed them at work. At dinner party, people muttered about the bad omen at their wedding, about David's mother's bravery. Margaret said nothing. She watered her roses, baked her bread, attended her widow's circle, until one evening, her phone rang again. The caller ID Low Country Literacy Foundation. Mrs. Hayes, the director said, "We heard your podcast. We'd like to feature your story in our national campaign. Your words, 'You are not a burden,' could be our theme." Margaret nearly dropped the phone. "My words, on a campaign?" "Yes," the director replied warmly. "Billboards, posters, schools across the country. We think you could change lives." Margaret looked at Robert's photo on the mantel, his watch gleaming in the fading light. She whispered, "You always told me I had more to give." Her heart swelled, not with vengeance, but with purpose. Later that night, her voicemail clicked. David's voice trembled through the static. "Mom, please, stop this. You're ruining everything." Margaret pressed delete without listening further, her fingers steady. "I didn't need his approval. I needed my own permission." Margaret let David's voicemail dissolve into silence. The delete button felt like a gavel, firm and final. For decades, she had lived at the mercy of his moods, his needs, his approval. Now, for the first time, she granted herself permission to stop answering. Her mornings changed. No longer spent worrying about calls or letters from her son, they filled with purpose. On Mondays and Thursdays, she drove to the Low Country Literacy Foundation's bright office downtown. Rows of children's books lined the walls. Laughter spilled from classrooms where volunteers guided small hands over new words. Mrs. Hayes, a little boy named Jonah, called, waving his spelling sheet. "I spelled butterfly without help." Margaret crouched beside him, her smile. "You're flying, Jonah. Don't stop." Each hour she spent there stitched something back into her, a part frayed by years of sacrifice. She realized she wasn't just giving, she was receiving too. One evening, her therapist Dr. Klein asked, "What feels different?" Margaret, "I used to believe I was in everyone's way. Now I see, maybe I've been paving the way." Dr. Klein nodded. "You're not a burden, you're a foundation." The words landed deeper than any courtroom ruling. Other volunteers, widows, retirees, young teachers, gathered around her during coffee breaks. They laughed about cooking mishaps, swapped garden tips, and remembered her birthday before she even mentioned it. One afternoon, a fellow tutor named Gloria leaned in. "You've got a gift, Margaret. You make everyone feel steady, like the ground won't crack beneath them." Margaret blinked back unexpected tears. No one in her family had ever said that. Her evenings grew lighter. She walked her neighborhood under the orange wash of street lamps, smiled at neighbors, accepted dinner invitations. Each yes to herself felt like a stitch in a quilt of belonging. Meanwhile, whispers about David and Hannah spread through town. Margaret didn't seek them out. They found her in the murmurs of church pews, the checkout line, whispers over casseroles at community potlucks. They canceled their honeymoon, her neighbor Mrs. Carver mentioned, eyes wide. "Too many bills, I heard." Shame after all that spectacle. Margaret stirred her tea, saying nothing. But inside, she felt a shift. For years her son's world had orbited appearances, glossy, fragile. Now cracks spidered through the surface. No longer her responsibility to mend. Her phone buzzed again with another message from David. This time, she didn't even listen. Instead, she slipped it into her pocket and knelt by her garden, hands deep in the earth, planting winter bulbs. "I am not your lifeline anymore," she whispered to the soil. "I am." At the literacy center, children's drawings began to cover the bulletin board, smiling stick figures labeled Mrs. H or Miss Margaret. She kept one in her purse, a crayon sketch of a woman holding a book with the caption, "Not a burden." Her story kept spreading. Strangers stopped her in the market to thank her. Women sent her letters describing their own humiliations at family events. Each note was a thread weaving her into something larger than her pain. For once, Margaret didn't feel small. She felt steady. One evening as she locked up after tutoring, Gloria approached breathless. "Did you hear? David and Hannah. They canceled their honeymoon. People are saying the marriage is cracking already." Margaret slid the key into her purse, her lips curving in the faintest smile. For once the collapse wasn't hers to carry. They hid my name at the wedding. Now it was on everyone's lips. She was the headline. It began small. Comments overheard at the corner cafe. "Did you hear about the mother at the wedding? The one they called Burden?" She walked out before the bride fainted. Maybe she cursed it. No, maybe she saved herself. The story twisted, reshaped, but always Margaret's name remained. And unlike before, it wasn't cloaked in pity. It was wrapped in admiration. Friends and strangers alike listened to her soft, steady voice recount the humiliation and the choice to walk away. Online, women copied her words into status updates, sharing lines like gospel, "I wasn't a burden. I was a foundation." One Sunday after church, Susan from her widow's group clasped Margaret's hands. "You don't know what you've started. You're becoming a voice for all of us." Margaret shook her head, modest. "I only spoke once." Susan smiled knowingly. "Sometimes once is all it takes." Truth echoes, but the ripples weren't kind to David and Hannah. At a bridal shop, whispers floated like confetti. She fainted because his own mother left. Imagine the shame. In grocery aisles, Margaret overheard murmurs about David's debts, Hannah's tantrum. She didn't feed them, but she didn't stop them either. At the Literacy Foundation, a young volunteer named Carla waved her phone. "Miss Margaret, you're trending on Facebook again." Someone wrote, "She walked out of humiliation and into history." Margaret laughed softly. "History? I was just tired." Carla grinned. "Exactly. That's why it matters. My daughter told me I was a burden too. I left her house and built my own life at 67. Thank you for showing me it wasn't too late." Tears blurred the ink. Margaret pressed the note to her chest, whispering, "You're welcome, whoever you are." She realized something she hadn't dared before. Her name was no longer just hers. It was becoming a lantern, passed hand to hand, illuminating paths for women she'd never meet. Meanwhile, David was drowning. His texts grew sharper, more desperate. "Mom, stop feeding gossip. You don't know what people are saying. We're drowning here. Help us." But Margaret never responded. For years she had rushed to his aid, patching holes in his life with money, with silence, with love. This time she folded each letter and placed it in Robert's old lockbox, letting the weight of his words rest where they couldn't hurt her. One night, as cicadas shrilled outside, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, journal open. She wrote slowly, deliberately. "They wanted me arrested. Instead I am written everywhere." She closed the book, the words final as scripture. Inside, in bold type, "Notice of final ruling, estate of Margaret Hayes." The judge's verdict had come. The law doesn't erase blood, but it can erase entitlements. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and stale coffee, the kind of place where truth and lies both dressed in pressed suits. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded neatly over her lap, pearls at her throat. She wasn't there to fight, she was there to finish. David entered late, Hannah trailing behind him only far enough to avoid suspicion. Her face was stiff, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. She slipped into the back row without touching his arm. David scanned the room, searching for sympathy, but found none. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, called the session to order. "This is the matter of Hayes vs. concerning inheritance, undue influence and fraud." David's attorney rose first, weaving his story like a tired fisherman casting net. He painted Margaret as fragile, unstable, a widow manipulated by loneliness. "My client only wishes to protect his mother from rash decisions." Margaret's lips curved barely. Protection had never been David's language. Her attorney stood next, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, let us not deal in vague sentiment. Let us deal in facts." He spread folders across the table, bank statements, forged credit applications, checks signed in David's hand. A paper trail as long as Margaret's sacrifice. Mrs. Hayes paid her son's tuition. She covered his medical bills. She even co-signed his first mortgage. Yet here he tapped the forged signature, bold and jagged, is proof he took without asking, without respect and without care for the very woman who gave him life. The courtroom murmured. Margaret sat still, her heartbeat steady. One by one, witnesses rose. Neighbors, nurses she once trained, even her church pastor. Each testified to Margaret's integrity, her generosity, her clear mind. "She's the woman who drove me to chemo every Thursday," one neighbor said. "She ran the blood drive for 20 years, the pastor added. Every word was a stone laid into the foundation of her dignity, stacking higher than David's excuses. David fidgeted, pulling at his collar. He whispered to his lawyer, but the lawyer only pressed his lips together, beaten. When the judge addressed him directly, David faltered. I just wanted what was fair." "Fair?" the judge repeated, her voice cold steel. "Is forging signatures fair? Is suing your mother after years of support fair?" David dropped his gaze to the table. Hours stretched, arguments spun, but by afternoon the truth lay bare. Margaret had carried her son, and in return he had tried to strip her name down to burden. The judge lifted her gavel. Silence held its breath. "This court finds no undue influence in the drafting of Mrs. Hayes's estate plan. Furthermore, the evidence of financial misconduct by Mr. David Hayes is entered into record. Effective immediately, he is removed from all inheritance rights. The estate will stand as written." The gavel fell like thunder. Margaret didn't flinch. She simply exhaled, a weight releasing after decades. "Hayes, do you have a comment? Is it true your son called you a burden? What do you say to other women in your position?" Margaret raised one hand gently, silencing the clamor. "No comment." She descended the steps slowly, each stride measured, purposeful. Behind her, David lingered in the doorway, jaw tight, eyes hollow. Hannah didn't stand with him. She was already walking away, phone pressed to her ear, voice sharp. Margaret reached her car, placed her bag carefully on the passenger seat, and allowed herself the smallest smile. Justice wasn't joy, but it was peace. "I opened it without anger. Just curiosity." The envelope trembled faintly in her hands, not because her fingers were weak, but because the past carried a weight heavier than paper. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the lamp casting a soft halo, her tea cooling untouched. She unfolded the letter slowly. David's handwriting was rushed, uneven. The words bled across the page in dark ink, some lines smudged, as though written through tears. "Mom, I don't know where else to turn. Everything's falling apart. Hannah barely speaks to me. People look at me like I'm poison. I didn't mean for it to get this far. I didn't know how to love you without using you. I'm sorry. I don't know who I am without your help." Margaret read each line without flinch. The ache of motherhood tugged faintly in her chest. Memories of scraped knees, piano recitals, late-night fevers, but over them, louder, stronger, was the echo of the nameplate. Burden. She placed the letter flat on the table, breathing in deeply. No anger burned in her veins, only a tired clarity. Margaret rose, crossed to the mantel, and opened Robert's old lockbox. Inside lay decades of memory, love letters, photographs, the first drawing David ever gave her, a stick figure labeled Mom. She tucked David's letter in carefully, pressing it between the past and the permanence of her own resolve. "I forgive you," she whispered, her voice steady, not shaking. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting." She sat back down, pulled a small metal tin from under the counter. Inside was the gold-lettered card from the wedding, the one that had broken her heart. Burden. Her hands didn't tremble as she carried it to the fireplace. She struck a match, the flame catching quickly. She held the card until the heat licked her fingertips, then released. The word curled, blackened, turned to ash. The glow faded, leaving only warmth in its place. For the first time in months, she felt light, not joyous, not triumphant, but free. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A voicemail from David, his voice hollow. "Please, Mom, just stop all this. I'm begging you." She didn't call back. She didn't need to. Instead, she turned to her laptop, opening an email from the nonprofit she had pledged her estate to. The director's message was warm, filled with gratitude. Margaret, your story has touched us deeply. We'd be honored to feature your words, "You are not a burden," on billboards across the state as part of our literacy and dignity campaign. Your resilience gives others courage. Margaret leaned back in her chair, a smile breaking gently across her lips. The words that once humiliated her would now be rewritten in light, towering over highways, whispered into the hearts of strangers who needed them most. She looked out her window. The night sky was clear, stars pricking through velvet darkness. She thought of Robert, steady and calm. She thought of all the nights she had rocked David to sleep, promising him he was safe. She had kept that promise, but now she owed promises to herself. The clock chimed softly. She closed her laptop, folded her hands, and whispered, "Tomorrow begins different." The next morning, her phone rang again, this time not David, but the nonprofit's director. "Margaret," the voice said, excitement bubbling. "Your words won't just be on billboards. A national publisher wants to adapt your story. Are you ready for the world to hear you?" They gave me humiliation. I gave the world a message. The first billboard rose on the edge of Charleston's main highway. Drivers slowed, glancing up at the clean white background. The words written in bold navy blue, "You are not a bird." Beneath it, a small line read, "Margaret's story in partnership with the South Carolina Literacy Foundation." Margaret stood at the base of it on a humid morning, the sky streaked with coral and gold. Cars honked as people read, a few drivers raising a hand in salute. For a moment, Margaret closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. Not the laughter of guests at a wedding, not the whispers of gossip, but recognition, respect, and resonance. Her phone buzzed with messages. Women from her support group, strangers online, old colleagues she hadn't spoken to in years, each said some version of the same thing. "Thank you, I needed this." She didn't tell many people at first, but she began keeping a shoebox in her living room, filled with letters that came pouring in, handwritten notes, emails printed and folded neatly. One said, "I left my husband last month. Your story gave me courage." Another, "My daughter makes me feel invisible, but you reminded me I'm still here." Margaret read them slowly, often with tea at night, tears slipping silently down her cheeks, not from sadness but from the strange power of connection. Her humiliation had multiplied into healing, not just for her, but for others like her. David and Hannah had left Charleston quietly. A neighbor mentioned their house sold in haste, furniture carted off in trucks at dawn. Margaret didn't ask questions. She didn't need to, their absence was its own answer. Her focus shifted instead to building. She met with the nonprofit regularly, volunteering at tutoring sessions where children clutched new books with wide-eyed wonder. The staff adored her calm steadiness, the way she sat beside a nervous 8-year-old and made reading feel like magic. "You're not just a donor," the director told her one evening. "You're part of the foundation now." Margaret smiled, touched. "I suppose I've always been a foundation. I just forgot it for a while." At home, she began reorganizing her life. She cleared closets of clothes she hadn't worn in years. She painted her bedroom a soft blue lighter than the heavy maroon Robert had once liked. She added a bird bath to her garden, delighting in the sparrows that came each morning. And quietly, in her attorney's office, she updated her will again, not just to exclude David, but to include scholarships. "Let's make them for nursing students," she said, voice steady. "In Robert's honor." Her attorney looked up, surprised. "That's a beautiful gesture." Margaret nodded. "Robert believed in care. I want that to live on." A documentary crew reached out, intrigued by the story of a mother who had turned a public humiliation into a movement. Margaret hesitated. She had never sought fame, but the director's words stayed with her. "This isn't about spectacle, it's about truth. Your truth." She agreed slowly, carefully. Filming began in her home, in her garden, in the quiet spaces where her resilience bloomed. She would think about the word that once scarred her, the nameplate in gold script, burden. It had been meant to break her. Instead, it had become her catalyst. The nonprofit began calling her a voice of dignity. Women's groups invited her to speak. Her calendar filled not with demands but with choices, and every choice felt like freedom. A production company just optioned your podcast episode. They want to adapt it into a full documentary national release. This is bigger than any billboard. Your story could reach millions. Margaret leaned back, stunned. The silence in her house felt alive, almost humming. Robert's watch ticked softly on the mantel. She whispered, almost to herself, "Millions will know I was never a burden." The words printed at the top made her breath catch. Keynote speaker. Margaret Allen. They put me in the back row with a nameplate. I built my own table. The ballroom glowed with golden light, chandeliers scattering prisms across polished floors. Margaret stood at the edge of the stage, a silk shawl draped over her shoulders, the murmur of hundreds of voices filling the air. The national conference had invited leaders, writers, activists, scholars, but tonight she wasn't in the back row. She was the keynote speaker. Her escort led her to the head table, her name in bold script before the gleaming silverware. Margaret Allen, just her name, no cruel titles, no backhanded labels. She traced the letters with her fingertip, breathing deeply. The same hands that once trembled over paper plates at family gatherings now held a microphone steady. When she rose, applause thundered. For a moment Margaret hesitated. Not from fear but from awe. "All this noise for me?" She began softly. "2 years ago, I walked out of a wedding. I walked out not because I was fragile but because I was finished. Finished being called less than what I am." The crowd leaned in. She spoke of dignity, of boundaries, of the thousands of invisible sacrifices mothers made. She described the weight of the word burden, how it burned her chest, how it forced her to rewrite her life. "And here's what I learned," she said, her voice rising with a power she didn't know she still had. "No one gets to decide your seat but you. Not your children, not society, not even the people you love most. You get to choose where you sit, and tonight I chose the head table." The room erupted. Applause rang louder than any wedding reception, louder than whispers of shame, louder than the silence that had followed her out of the church doors that day. Back home, her life blossomed in smaller, quieter ways too. Her garden flourished, wild roses curling around the fence posts. Neighbors often stopped by with pies or just conversation, sitting with her on the porch swing. She had friends now, chosen family, women who remembered her birthday before she had to remind anyone. Champ, her loyal dog, followed her from room to room, curling beside her when she wrote in her journal. She had become both anchor and sail, steady yet always moving forward. On her mantel, Robert's watch ticked steadily, a heartbeat that carried her into each new day. Beside it stood a framed card sent by the nonprofit. "You are not a burden, you are a foundation." She hadn't planned anything beyond a simple dinner with a few friends. But when she walked into her living room, she froze. The chandelier glowed, the table brimmed with food. Laughter rang through the house. Friends had decorated with streamers and candles, a cake glittering with her name. They shouted in unison, "Surprise!" Margaret pressed a hand to her chest. Overwhelmed, tears welled, not from sorrow but from the staggering realization she was finally celebrated, not for what she gave away, not for what she endured, but simply for being herself. As the candles flickered, Champ barked happily, the room alive with warmth. She leaned forward, closing her eyes for just a moment, whispering a wish that wasn't really a wish at all. It was gratitude. "Because when they forgot me, I remembered me." Her friends clinked glasses, laughter rolling through the room. For the first time in decades, she felt no hollowness, no ache of exclusion, only fullness. Later that night, after the guests had gone and Champ snored softly at her feet, Margaret sat with her journal. She wrote the words slowly, savoring them. The ceremony collapsed, but I rose. She closed the book, placed Robert's watch on top, and smiled. This was her seat now, not at the back, not labeled, not forgotten. A seat she had built herself, sturdy, radiant, and entirely hers.